Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz. That represents a quarter of global seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's LNG. Strikingly, over 80% of these energy shipments are routed directly to Asian markets. Transporting this cargo requires thousands of massive supertankers to navigate directly through a physically constricted, contested maritime chokepoint, often under close observation by naval forces. Because the strait sits between the coastlines of Iran and Oman, a common assumption is that these nations possess the unilateral legal authority to close the waterway at will. Trade flow dependence does not equate to sovereign control over those flows. Geographic boundaries and legal maritime authority operate under completely separate frameworks. To accurately gauge the risk in Hormuz, we have to look past political rhetoric. The actual operating environment is defined by the intersection of physical hydrography, overlapping territorial claims, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. At its narrowest point, the physical distance between the opposing shores of the Strait of Hormuz measures between 21 and 29 miles wide, depending on the exact points of measurement. Yet ships cannot use that entire width. The local bathymetry is filled with shallow waters and treacherous depths, restricting the safe navigable space to a fraction of the total distance. This vector map visualizes the institutionalized routing scheme. It dictates a rigid pathway, a 2-mile wide westbound lane, a 2-mile central buffer zone, and a 2-mile wide eastbound lane. By adopting this specific geometry, the scheme forces massive energy flows into a predictable, inescapable 6-mile wide corridor. The vulnerability of Hormuz is a direct output of these unyielding hydrographic realities. The geography itself funnels a quarter of the world's seaborne oil into a bottleneck that is easily monitored from the shoreline. Moving westward, the geography remains complex. Here we find the disputed islands of Abu Musa and the Tunbs. Published sailing directions show the designated sea lanes charted directly adjacent to these islands, requiring vessels to pass either immediately north or south of them. This routing is not optional. The surrounding waters contain drying flats, hidden shoals, and sunken rocks, forcing deep draft vessels to stay within established, rigid corridors. Adding to natural hazards are man-made constraints. The approaches are crowded with restricted offshore oil infrastructure and submarine pipelines that further reduce the navigable depth. Because shipping compresses tightly here, it creates an operational bottleneck. However, the IMO and hydrographic authorities classify this area as approaches with routing measures, not a distinct, legally recognized strait. The physical proximity of these contested islands to the channelized shipping lanes means that coastal forces stationed there have significantly shortened response times for surveillance or interdiction. The strategic value of Abu Musa and the Tunbs provides tactical anti-access leverage derived entirely from physical geography. It does not confer lawful jurisdiction over the international shipping passing by. Coastal states extend their territorial sea 12 nautical miles from their baselines. We map these boundaries projecting from Oman and Iran. Because the strait is narrower than 24 miles, these claims intersect. The overlap completely envelops the shipping lanes, leaving no high seas corridor. Normally, foreign ships travel through territorial waters under the rules of innocent passage. This regime grants the coastal state broad discretion to regulate traffic and, under certain conditions, the right to suspend passage entirely. UN-CLOS applies a separate, stronger framework called transit passage, specifically for international straits. The differences are stark. Unlike innocent passage, transit passage explicitly guarantees overflight rights for aircraft and allows submarines to operate in normal, submerged modes without surfacing. Most crucially, the transit passage framework contains an explicit structural prohibition against any coastal state hampering or suspending international navigation for any reason. The law dictates that a state can assert full territorial sovereignty over the waters of a strait, but that sovereignty remains permanently subject to the international navigation rights of the ships passing through it. The geopolitical friction in Hormuz arises from a persistent legal dispute over who exactly is bound by these rules of transit passage. Oman is a fully ratified party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They are strictly bound by treaty to honor the transit passage framework. Iran's status is different. They signed the UN Clause Treaty in 1982, but the Iranian government never ratified it. In a signature declaration, Iran explicitly argued that transit passage is merely a contractual right. In their view, it only benefits states that are formal members of the treaty, rather than applying as a universal rule. Iran codified this stance in its 1993 Marine Areas Act. This domestic legislation relies on older baselines to claim the waters between certain islands as internal Iranian waters. The most highly contested element of that 1993 act is the requirement that foreign warships must obtain prior authorization before passing through Iranian territorial seas. Major maritime powers routinely reject these domestic laws. They file diplomatic protests maintaining that transit passage has become customary international law, meaning it applies to all states regardless of treaty membership. This legal clarity extends to the concept of transit fees. Under both innocent passage and transit passage, coastal states are strictly prohibited from charging tolls for mere passage through the strait. The baseline threat in Hormuz emerges where physical geography meets an unresolved legal dispute. The core friction is whether free navigation is a universal customary right or an exclusive treaty privilege that can be denied. Ultimately, the vulnerability of global energy markets is a function of pure volume and transit dependence. It is not derived from any single nation's lawful sovereign ownership of these trade flows. Even with overlapping territorial seas covering the entire strait, international law is structurally designed to prevent the unilateral control or suspension of passage in this corridor. Yet those legal protections clash with strict physical constraints. Because the navigation lanes are extremely narrow and viable bypass pipelines are severely limited, the capacity for asymmetric interference remains highly feasible. Strategic tension in the Strait of Hormuz persists because the waterway sits at the exact intersection of absolute hydrographic constraints and deeply disputed maritime law.